courts, as I understand you have been doing at other places too. Please help me welcome Jerry Patterson.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a pretty good place. I mean, this looks like, when I first ran for office, I think the entire party, Harris County Republican Party, would have been in the room over here without any furniture. But anyway, I'm Jerry Patterson. I'm the 27th Commissioner of the Texas General Land Office. I could talk a lot and about a lot of things, so I'm going to try to, anybody, you can look up what I do. If you can look that up. I mean, the land office is the oldest office in Texas. Bottom line is we do three things. We make money, about $500 million a year, off of state lands that are constitutionally dedicated to education. That's primarily by oil and gas leasing, but now we're doing other things as well. Real estate investments with our returns from oil and gas. I make money. I chair boards for lease for both university lands, which is the Permanent University Fund, and the school lands, Permanent School Fund. So make money. Number two function, and I'm really going pretty brief here, is I chair another organization called the Texas Veterans Land Board, which is a program that's been around in practice since 1837 and in statute since 1947. Where we provide low-interest loans for Texas veterans to buy dirt, to buy land, to buy raw land. And if you have any questions about that, go to texasveterans.com. We also do loans for veterans to buy homes. And the great thing about that program is you can combine the Texas Veterans Land Board home loan with a VA, FHA, or conventional, and we buy the rate down by about 0.5%. So whatever the quote is on a VA, FHA, or conventional, if you come to the VLD, it'll be 0.5 point lower. And we loan up to $417,000. We also have long-term care facilities for Texas veterans. We have 8 of them. So I take care of the veterans programs in Texas. Most people don't know Texas has its own veterans programs, but it has had its own veterans programs since 1837. It started out just giving veterans land, and of course we ran out of land to give away. The other thing that I'm responsible for is the Texas coast, which is probably the most controversial portion of what I do, because we have a dynamic coast, and unfortunately it's moving the wrong direction. It's moving landward. Of course, it's always been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, which gets into a property rights issue of adjudicating where the state-owned submerged land is and where the upland private property owner's land is. But bottom line, if you're thinking about buying a beach house, keep in mind that that is a very risky endeavor, and the government's not in the business of bailing you out. And there are people who come to me thinking that I'm going to rebuild their beach or pay them for their lost land that washed away by Hurricane Ike or Dolly or Katrina or Rita, and that's not what we do. So when you caveat emptor. A little history. I mean, I was born and raised in Houston. I'm 66 years old. I went to Texas A&M. Thank you. All right. I crammed a normal 4-year course at A&M into only 5 years. And I finished in the top 75% of my class at A&M. So, and 20 some odd years later, my son did exactly the same thing. After I graduated from A&M, I went to the Marine Corps. I served the last 6 months of the Vietnam War in Vietnam, left on the day of the ceasefire, which was 26 January of '73. Came back stateside, stayed active duty for 10 years, got out and stayed in the reserve, and I retired from the Marine Corps Reserve as a lieutenant colonel in 1993. Went to flight school. I flew fighters, F-4s. You probably don't recognize anymore. Most of them are up on pedestals at various museums now. Flew Phantoms and the Marines. And then when I'm back in Texas, when I left active duty, came back to Texas, I ran for Congress. Came in second out of two people. Then 1990, I ran for the Texas legislature, the Senate, against a 28-year incumbent named Chet Brooks. Again, I came in second out of 2. And then in 1992, redistricting made that seat, which is normally a 4-year term, up again, and I ran against the same gentleman again. Got 48.5% of the vote in the general, and there's no runoff. That was more than the Libertarian candidate and the Democratic incumbent, so we surprised virtually everybody and defeated the Dean of the Senate on a very low budget, door knocking, handshaking, baby kissing, never say die campaign. So I'm a member of the legislature. I campaigned against a 30-year incumbent with the campaign slogan of limit politicians' terms, not prisoners' terms. Because if you remember in the early 90s, we had a real big issue about early release. There were earned, there was a provision whereby you got 2 for 1 and good time, and you could actually get out of prison in 1/5 of the time that your sentence would have been. And we were releasing some really bad actors who subsequently committed other horrific crimes. I can't think of the guy's name, but it's not important. But anyway, so I campaigned on that platform, limit politicians' terms, not prisoner terms. After I got to Austin, I realized it wasn't as I thought it was. And I changed my mind on term limits. I said, that's not a good thing, because it empowers the staff, the folks that were there when you got there, and they are going to be there when you leave, and it empowers the lobby. But nonetheless, I campaigned on that platform, so I left after 2 terms in the Senate, because I said that's what I was going to do. Ran for land commissioner in 1998. My opponent was David Dewhurst. He outspent me 10-1. He got 51.2% of the vote in 1998. So 4 years later, I came back, ran again, and in the primary, and won, and then again won in the general election. When I was in the Senate, I'm probably best known as the author of Senate Bill 60, actually in 1995, which was Texas concealed handgun law. And I'd like to get a quick show of hands of those of you who have been involved in a shootout at a 4-way stop since we passed that legislation. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but you remember in 1995, every daily newspaper in the state of Texas said if we pass that bill, it will be wild, wild west, shootouts at every 4-way stop and blood in the streets, and none of that happened. As a matter of fact, there's been a precipitous decline in firearms homicides since, well, I passed it first in 93, Governor Richards vetoed it. I passed it again in 95, Governor Bush signed it. But in that almost 20 years since that time, firearms homicides per 100,000, the rate in the United States, and of course after we passed our concealed handgun law, other states followed as well, but the homicide rate by firearms has gone from 7 to less than 3 from the years 93 to 2010. That's a 60% decline. Now, I can't tell you that that's because of the concealed handgun law passed in Texas and other states after 1993, but what I can tell you is those anti-Second Amendment, anti-liberty people who believe that you and I were too stupid, too violent, or too incompetent to carry a firearm, and are the same people now saying we need more gun control in Washington, I can tell you they were wrong. The premise that a citizen cannot make good choices is a premise that I can't accept. When I was also in the legislature, I passed another bill that was very controversial, almost got me beat in an election, and right after that by my Democrat opponent. And that was what I believe to be the most significant property rights bill passed in the last 40 years. You may recall that in Texas, you were considered by our Constitution to be uniquely incompetent and unable to manage your home equity. Because in Texas, you could only use your home equity as collateral for a home improvement loan. You could not use it as collateral for a loan for some of the purpose that you, as the citizen homeowner, might choose. In other words, I could borrow money using my home equity as collateral, and since my home equity was collateral, the interest rate was lower, and since the home equity was collateral, the interest was deductible on federal income tax. I could borrow money using the home equity as collateral for a patio hot tub. But if I wanted to send my kids to college or start a business, or frankly, being the libertarian that I am, if I wanted to go to Vegas and blow it, which is my choice, not the government's, if I wanted to do that, I was prohibited under the Constitution of the state of Texas from using my home equity as collateral for anything other than a home improvement loan. I carried that 3 sessions, and I never got a vote in committee the first session. The second session, I got it out of the Senate, it died in the House. The second session, I got it out of the Senate, it passed the House. And since it's a constitutional amendment, it has to go to the voters. It has to pass the houses by 2/3 of the membership, and then it's got to go to the voters for approval by simple majority. And the voters approved it like 65%. It was a property rights issue. And all the detractors were saying he's trying to overturn the homestead protection. The homestead, that's a property tax term, frankly. Homestead exemptions, it's a property tax provision. So I passed that bill, constitutional amendment. The other, maybe a little esoteric, I'm not a motorcycle guy. I take enough chances flying a little airplane around Texas. I've got one airplane that was made in 1944, so I take chances, but I don't ride motorcycles. But I also repealed the mandatory motorcycle helmet law, which I thought was an imposition on liberty. And we passed a law that says if you have insurance, you can choose not to wear a helmet. And there was a lot of argument over that. And one of the arguments was uncompensated care. We can't have somebody having uncompensated care if they make themselves into a vegetative state, but the same people would then cite the higher fatality rate by people who weren't wearing helmets. You can't have it both ways. You got to pick one. You got to pick one that says they're vegetative state, or you got to pick the one that says they're all going to die. And frankly, dead people are a very small impact on our healthcare costs. I mean, that's just a fact. I'm sorry, I don't want to be brutal about it, but that's a fact. So I've repealed the motorcycle helmet law, and I got a lot of people supporting me in my campaigns. I think some of them who couldn't vote because they were probably felons, but nonetheless, I had a lot of support from the biker crowd, if you will, but I'm not riding a motorcycle. When I laid out for, I ran for land commissioner. David Dewhurst won that, and then 4 years later I came back when he decided to run for lieutenant governor, and I ran for land commissioner again and won. Now, kind of an esoteric office. Let me tell you some of the things we've done during that period of time. We've had constant conflicts over oil and gas with, the environmentalists are in Texas. It ain't like California, but they're still here. My first encounter with them was 2003 or 2004, I can't recall. We own the minerals, we being the Permanent School Fund, own the minerals in Laguna Madre, which is inland from Padre Island National Seashore, and we own the minerals in the Gulf of Mexico going out 9 nautical miles. Other states are 3, we're 9, that's a long story, but trust me on that. And all that revenue is dedicated to PSF. Well, the Sierra Club, the National Park Service, it's an interesting story. A former land commissioner in 1962, when they were creating the national park at Padre Island, objected because they were going to convey the minerals to the federal government, and the land commissioner, Jerry Sadler, said, hell no, we're not doing that. He raised enough stink to where the minerals did not convey. They remained with the private mineral owners or the Permanent School Fund. Well, with natural gas prices, at that time, natural gas prices were going back up. I mean, they got above $10 there for a while. So that production is mostly natural gas. So all of a sudden, it hasn't been drilled since the 50s, but all of a sudden there's interest because the economics work. And so the people were petitioning to drill, to put a well pad on the island and drill horizontally out into Laguna Madre or into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Sierra Club got involved in that, trying to shut it down, trying to save the turtles. So I got into litigation with the Sierra Club, and we won that because the deal that was made in 1962 trumps the supremacy clause of the Constitution. Federal law is supreme to state law is supreme to county law is supreme, that's supremacy clause of the Constitution. But thanks to Land Commissioner Jerry Sadler, who insisted that as a condition of conveyance that we reserve the minerals, and that if they were ever prohibited from being developed, the ownership of the surface would revert back to the private owners of the state. So a land commissioner, do the math, 1962, set me up to defend our sovereignty and our resources and do so successfully. Now what happened? We started drilling, producing natural gas. That's substantially down now because natural gas is above $4 for the first time in a long time. And it was so much fun because at the time Ann Richards was still alive, and she was talking about she's going to go down there and she's going to chain herself to a gas drilling bulldozer. Now I don't know how much you know about oil and gas, but we generally don't get it down there by using a D6 Caterpillar. We actually have to have a borehole, a vertical borehole. So that was an interesting fight. That was a lot of fun. More recently, we have a runaway Department of the Interior, particularly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who are responsible for making designations of endangered species. We have an Endangered Species Act that passed, I think, in '72. For the first 35 years or so, there were about 30 species a year nominated for consideration. The statute, the federal law says that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has 12 months to make a decision. And that worked okay when you're doing 30 species a year. But then groups like the Center for Biodiversity, the Wild Earth Guardians, these radical leftist anti-oil and gas environmental groups got involved, and they started nominating like 300 or 400 species a year. Fish and Wildlife couldn't respond, so they were automatically in violation of their one-year statutory deadline. So Wild Earth Guardians and Center for Biodiversity sued U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they settle out of court and queue up these species to be designated as endangered. Well, what makes it particularly galling is during the period, I think 2004 to 2011, one of these groups, either Wild Earth Guardians or Center for Biodiversity, received almost $1 million from U.S. Fish and Wildlife for, quote, conservation efforts. And during that same period of time, they sued U.S. Fish and Wildlife 76 times. We give them money and they sue us. That's how the federal government operates. So one of the species that was queued up to be designated is prolific in the Permian Basin in West Texas and in eastern New Mexico. It's called the dune sagebrush lizard, commonly known as the DSL. It's related to a sagebrush lizard. You can't tell the difference by looking at them until you catch a little grubby thing and roll him over, and you got to count the scales on his thoracic, on his belly. And the SL is not endangered. The DSL has only been a species for less than 20 years, and now they're crowing, it's endangered. And so they wanted to designate it as endangered. Obviously that impacts what I do because it impacts the income of the Permanent University Fund and the Permanent School Fund. We got involved in that fight. We weren't getting much attention. It's just another day in Washington. And I went up there and testified in Congress in opposition to it. We weren't getting much attention. Then I had the opportunity to be on Fox and Friends in the morning, and I talked about this DSL, and I said, we in Texas call that, here we call that reptile dysfunction. And then I got a lot of attention, All of a sudden, people wanted me on TV just to say the two words reptile dysfunction, But we didn't, we won that and we didn't. They generated so much pressure that the Obama administration tried to compromise. They didn't designate it as endangered because of an effort the state of Texas put together called I can't remember what, HCP, Habitat Conservation Program, to where we put all these Herculean efforts together to try to save the lizard, which frankly this effort is probably more onerous than designation. And we prohibited that designation, and so the Fish and Wildlife folks blessed it, and then just last month, these same plaintiffs are suing again because of the agreement doesn't protect the lizard. You cannot trust those people. So anyway, I've been involved in that, and we have a lot of other issues that are kind of esoteric. I'm running for Lieutenant Governor in 2014. I'm in my third term as Land Commissioner, and I intend to run for Lieutenant Governor. I made this decision about 2 years ago when it looked like Senator Hutchinson was going to leave office, and she did. And it looked like for a long time that, until things turned around a little bit there, that David Dewhurst was going to be the next U.S. Senator, open seat. But I'm still in, I'm not necessarily, David Dewhurst is a friend of mine. I think his heart's in the right place. But I'm known as a guy who is fairly bold. When I carried the concealed handgun law, that was a bold thing to do. I gotta tell you, I was the only person who stepped up to carry it, and when we were about to pass it, we had an incident in Corpus Christi where Selena was shot by her secretary or whatever. All of a sudden, the public opinion went south. And people came to me and said, can you pull that bill down? I said, no. And when you put a referendum on it, I'll vote for it if you'll let me put a referendum amendment to where it's subject to approval of the voters. I said, no. Constitutional rights are not subject to referendum. I'm sorry. And what you don't understand is that our Constitution is, particularly the Bill of Rights, it is not a grant of liberty. Anybody who says, well, that Second Amendment's getting kind of dangerous out there, it was good in 1775 when we were fighting the British, it was good in 1875 when we were fighting the Indians, but it's outlived its usefulness, we need to repeal it. Doesn't understand that you cannot repeal a natural right. that the founders argued this point in the 1780s, when they were debating the Bill of Rights, whether we should even list these things, because if you list them, you imply that government granted them. If you list them, you might leave something off the list and imply that that's not included. They don't understand. That's merely an enumeration of rights that we possess by virtue of being born free men and free women. These are natural rights. You cannot take them away. You cannot amend it. And furthermore, when you look at the gun controversy now, and those who, like Obama and others, who will tell you they support the Second Amendment. I'm a hunter. I support the Second Amendment. I'm telling you, it has nothing to do with hunting. It only has to do with my ability to protect myself from an oppressive government or from a criminal element, an oppressive government from within or without. But when you look at this discussion of those people who believe we can whittle its worn out its usefulness, and they look at the tragic incidents that have occurred, whether it was Aurora, Colorado, whether it was Columbine, whether it was Sandy Hook, and they say it's just too dangerous allowing citizens with guns, we need to repeal it. I say, if you want to make things safer, let's, for the sake of discussion only, let's repeal the First Amendment. That will make it safer. Because while we've had a precipitous decline in firearms homicides, and a not quite so, firearms homicides down over 50% in almost 20 years, suicide down about 20%, accidental death by firearm down about 25%. At the same time, gun ownership is going up dramatically. We have not had, or I can't measure it at least, or at least anecdotally, we have not had a decrease in venue shootings. I call them venue shootings because they're places where, venues where guns are prohibited, schools, theaters, things of that nature. We haven't had a decrease, or I can't statistically measure it, but it doesn't seem like we have. So if you want to prohibit, if you look at the people who are doing the venue shootings, they're not all there. So I submit we don't have a gun problem, we have a nutcase problem. And if you want to protect us, if you could theoretically repeal something that would make us safer, it'd be the First Amendment. Because the right of the broadcast media, after one of these shootings occurs, to 24/7 have the miscreant, mentally deranged 19-year-old video violent game player on TV for that other kid who's out there somewhere playing those games in the basement. That kid is right on the bubble, and he looks at that picture and he says, I can be somebody. So if you want to make things safer, you would repeal the First Amendment for the Second. I'm not in favor of either. What government doesn't understand, what the Democrats don't understand, what Michael Bloomberg doesn't understand is that liberty has a price. The First Amendment right to report to news such as these shooters results in copycat killing. The Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms results on criminals occasionally getting guns and doing bad things. The Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination allows guilty people to go free and kill again. But that's the price of liberty. You cannot have absolute security and safety, or you live in a police state, and then you don't have absolute security and safety. Anyway, I don't, that's just, I love talking about the Second Amendment, and I talk about it a lot, because it's a truth teller with me as to whether somebody is liberty-oriented or not. Anyway, I'm running for lieutenant governor. There may be others in the race. Governor Dewhurst currently says that he is planning on running for re-election. There's a gentleman, a friend of mine named Todd Staples, as the current ag commissioner. There's a rumor that Susan Combs may be in the race. I just know what I'm doing, and I'm doing it because I'm at a point in my life where I have nothing to prove, and I really don't have anybody to make happy, and I don't have any intention of doing so. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. You may disagree with me. We can be respectful. We can disagree without being disagreeable. But I'm going to tell you what I think. And I'm one of the few people that has done that consistently and repetitively throughout my political career. Most recently, there's been only one statewide elected official, matter of fact, one elected state official, period, statewide or otherwise, who for the last 4 years has stood up and said, we need to do something other. When we come to immigration, it needs to be something other than a bumper sticker, bill of defense, or no amnesty, or whatever you want to call it. And that would include a guest worker program. I'm in favor of that, have been for 4.5 years. And I'll tell you that, and I'll tell anybody that, because I firmly believe that's the right thing to do. And lo and behold, after I spoke to the Republican convention last June on Friday night, 8,000 delegates, I walked up to the mic. They had to suspend the rules because I was not a delegate. and spoke, and I said, I'm going to speak in favor of a guest worker plank on our platform, and I walked away from the mic saying, well, there was the end of a relatively decent political gig, off and on for about 20 years. It passed by a 3-to-1 margin and survived subsequent challenges by similar margins. Our immigration law policy should be for our benefit. If it benefits people in other countries who want to raise their standard of living or what, that's okay. But number one, it's for us. And everything we do should be focused on what works for the United States. I'm a person who opposes unconditional birthright citizenship. I oppose the stupidity of bilingual ballots. Can you imagine going to Mexico and asking them to print you a ballot in English? I oppose amnesty. I oppose this, this idea that, we got to make these people citizens. That's the only thing for it. I'm not in favor of a path to citizenship, but I'm telling you, there are employers in Houston, Texas that can't get workers. How many of y'all want to go hang drywall? How many want to be framers? There's a gentleman. Okay. How many want to frame houses, or work in restaurants? We have a segment in our workforce that is not being filled. We have people who could create economy, and our problem is when it is filled, it's filled with someone who is here that's not paying taxes. They're not having to withhold. They're being paid on a 1099, if that. They're otherwise being paid cash. That money is, we're paying the burden. We're paying somebody who is working for an employer that's not providing health insurance. So the Texas solution, which is what passed in our platform, requires a true employer-employee relationship. It requires health insurance. It requires a penalty paid for if you've done here illegally. And what's important about that, and I'm a Marine. I spent, I know a little bit about offense and defense. Whatever the number is, let's say it's 12 million. I hear it's 12 million illegals or undocumented or whatever the hell you want to call them. I don't care. Whatever that number is, there's a substantial number, I would say over half. Let's just say it's half for the sake of making the discussion. Half that want to work, want to pay taxes, want to send money home to their family, and want to cross the border on holidays. That's what they're looking for. But we're chasing both halves. Our border security forces are chasing both halves. What we want to do is segment the people who want to work, pay taxes, be able to cross the border, obey our laws, from the people who are the coyotes, the drug runners, the criminals, the human traffickers, the guys that drive it, DWI and kill people on the roads, so that our resources can chase the bad guys and we can bring the good guys into a regulated, tax-paying environment. This is nothing new. I've got clippings from the Galveston Daily News from 1885 talking about a guest worker program. We all know about the Bracero program, which started in 1942 and ended in the mid-60s, and it ended because labor and the Democrats got a hold of it and made it to where it was not working for employers. And I'll tell you a story. It's a funny story. It's a true story. We have an issue today about children in our schools who are primary Spanish speakers, and how do we educate these children, whether we use the immersion method or the bilingual method. We had a governor. Our first lady governor was not Ann Richards. Our first lady governor was Miriam A., initials M.A., they called her Ma Ferguson. Her husband was James E., they called him Pa Ferguson, and Pa Ferguson was governor until he was impeached in 1919, kicked out of office for, among other things, selling pardons. Matter of fact, the joke in Texas then was if you bumped into Ma Ferguson and said, oh, pardon me, she'd say, oh, no, you have to talk to my husband about that. But Ma Ferguson, after Paul got kicked out of office, and 1922, she runs for governor with a slogan, Ma and Paul Ferguson, 2 governors for the price of 1. She gets in a runoff with the Ku Klux Klan candidate, Felix H. Robertson. At that time, we didn't have Republicans, so she beat the Klan candidate in a runoff. She's now governor, and they had the same issue in 1922 as today. How do we teach children who are primary Spanish speakers? Ma Ferguson was asked that question and responded by what I believe to be the most infamous quote in Texas political history, when she says that if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the school children of Texas. I'm not going to argue with that. I got to run the Republican primary. I know what you got to do. But, so there's nothing new. And I spend a lot of time on the border, not in the Rio Grande Valley, not in the heavily populated areas, but far west in Presidio County, in Hudspeth County and El Paso County, where there ain't nobody there, I'm telling you. We have property, the Permanent School Fund has property down there. I spend a lot of time down there. I fly my airplane, landed on dirt strips that were used by the Army Air Corps in 1917 and 18 when they were chasing Pancho Villa. You know, we talk about border violence. We had a hell of a lot more border violence between 1916 and 1920 than we have today. We had cross-border raids. It killed 18 people in Columbus, New Mexico, 4 or 5 in Bright Ranch and near Marfil. It was a terrible time. Anyway, I probably talk more than I need, but I'd be happy to answer some questions or whatever. I mean, the questions will lead to more conversation. I can stay here as long as y'all want.